Welcome to the presentation for my new book release, Sex Wars by Roy Barzilai. Here on the book cover, we see the title, How Hormones Drive Gender, Race and Culture Conflicts. The cover image is a depiction of the fall of man by Michelangelo during the Renaissance. This is a depiction of the biblical story of the Tree of Knowledge. Beautifully depicts the prime human motives associated with the body and mind. Sex, temptation, authority, morality, the seeking true knowledge and morality of good and evil. Sex, life and death of the body are contrasted with the mind acquiring moral reasoning and knowing the eternal truth of God. Well, the Christian doctrine of the fall is associated with the doctrine of original sin, the fall of the world into the sins of the flesh and sex. This pessimistic view of human nature is in contrast to Genesis 1, that depicts the creation of the world for the good of man and blesses him to be fruitful and multiply. This dualism between creation and destruction, mind and body, and good and evil is the primary force in our religious and cultural worldviews. And as portrayed in Sex Wars, the course of human history can be framed as a pendulum continuously swinging between these two extremes. This is the cover of my previous book, The Testosterone Hypothesis from 2015, How Hormones Regulate the Life Cycle of Civilization. We see here the rise and fall of the Roman Empire depicted in the image with the early rise reaching greatness and finally culminating in its demise. Well, the question is, why do empires rise and fall in this way and why civilizations decline? My thesis is these are regulated. As visualized in this picture, we can see that sex hormones form the difference between male and female bodies. But this also, there are great differences in the brain. Today, however, we see a decline in sexual differentiation, whereas in the 50s, in the 80s, men and women were envisioned as a different gender. Today there is the binary gender differentiation is undermined by transgenderism. To understand how hormones regulate our reproductive life cycles and even the rise and fall of human cultures and civilizations, we have to understand our endocrine system. This is a chart depicting the major endocrine glands. We see the testes in men and the ovaries in females, but our primary master hormone regulator is found actually in the brain. It's called the hypothalamus. It's above the pituitary gland and it directs the entire flow of hormones. This image depicts how our daily circadian rhythm, our biological clock, operates according to hormonal cycles secreted by the hypothalamus. During the morning when the sun is shining, the hypothalamus orders the secretion of higher testosterone levels and higher serotonin levels, so we feel happy when the sun is shining. But during the night, when the sun falls, the hormone serotonin that causes us to feel happy falls and is transformed into melatonin, the sleep hormone, and then we fall to sleep. This chart depicts how testosterone regulates our reproductive life cycle and aging process until death. When we are young, testosterone levels rise in puberty and adolescence, reaching their peak in the 20s when we reach peak fertility and we form families and reproduce. Then we age and finally this culminates in death and the new generation will take over. However, not only as individuals do we age due to testosterone decline, our whole civilization is now going through aging. We see this chart of statistics published in the United States of 20% testosterone decline since the 1980s till 2005. 20% is very significant. This chart was published in 2006, but the academic establishment is now controlled by feminists who refuse to, since 2006, it is now 2018, refuse to release any new study on the level of testosterone in society. And this is very unfortunate because we suffer a great level of depression, anxiety, and stress due to decline in testosterone and serotonin, both of these hormones. In this chart, we see the huge rise in use of antidepressants since 2000 in the West. This is a huge problem. Depression rates are rising rapidly due to the collapse of testosterone and serotonin levels. Antidepressants are designed to raise serotonin, but because of declining solar radiation, which I further discuss later, we see that serotonin levels are in rapid decline, and the feminist academic establishment is refusing to address these issues. So the drug industry is simply addicting the many men and even more women to this drug abuse problem. There is also a 400% increase in use of antidepressants in the United States over 10 years since 1998. Here I want to address the issue of how testosterone and other sex hormones drive our fertility rates, the inclination for marriage, family formation, and raising children. We see a huge decline in these charts over the last 2 centuries in birth rates in the United States, leading to a very pessimistic culture in the 1930s. This led to the rise of extremely dangerous regimes in the 1930s, such as Nazism in Germany and communism in Russia, which brought the death of many tens of millions of people during World War II. However, we see that birth rates increased and there was a baby boom during the 1940s and 50s. Also during this period, capitalism triumphed again. Western liberty won over Nazi socialism in Germany. And I associate these trends to a rise in hormonal levels. We see in this chart that dropping annual birth rates in America are a warning sign to a coming depression. During the 1920s, we see that the birth rates started to plummet much before the Great Depression, but during the Great Depression it became worse. But when birth rates rose again, the economy recovered and the capitalism became fashionable again and prosperity ensued. Similarly, since the Great Recession of 2007, birth rates have plummeted remarkably, but we have not yet entered the Great Depression. However, I think that we are now in the peak of a huge bubble, financial bubble, that will eventually, probably sooner rather than later, collapse, causing another Great Depression. And we are at great danger of another rise of Nazism and communism around the world. Now I would like to discuss some philosophical issues associated with the intersection of sex, hormone, and how it shapes our mind and philosophy of life. Here we see a depiction of Chinese philosophy, the concept of yin and yang, masculine versus feminine mind. And the Chinese philosophy is extremely advanced in conceptualizing these issues. The darkness is associated with the feminine, the moon. Lack of solar energy, as we've seen, causes decline in testosterone and happy hormones, happy chemicals. And the masculine side is associated, is more active, more light, more masculine, more strength. And it actually depicts how our brain really works, because when solar radiation, as we've seen, is rising, it leads to higher testosterone level and a more masculine ideal and more empowerment for society at large. And this chart depicts the pendulum of history rotating between the 2 extremes of the masculine versus feminine. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who is considered the heir for Freud, depicted the masculine with the logos, more logical, analytical mind, versus the feminine with the eros, connected to sexual attraction, to emotions, feelings, and social bonding. Social biology is a new approach to science, integrating social sciences with biology. This was introduced by E.O. Wilson, a famous Harvard biologist, He wrote the book in the 1970s, and he is a famous ant researcher that uses his knowledge of the social species of the ants to further explore the human social bonding systems, how we structure our societies, and this is a groundbreaking work. In this book, published in 2012, E.O. Wilson suggests that similar to ants, we are humans also an ultra-social species, and this explains our huge success in conquering the earth. The most successful species, two species, are both ants and humans, and both are extremely social. He explains this, he calls this eusociality, truly social species, and very few species in evolution enjoy this benefit of social cooperation for building a nest and intentionally working together. Both humans and ants have this capacity of shared intentionality, where we can work together with millions of individuals cooperating mutually and dividing labor and defending our territory, our nest, and this is, according to Wilson, the source of our success. This book, Darwin's Cathedral, published in 2002, suggests that we evolved to form elaborate social groups and interconnected relationships, and that is the root of our religious traditions. We form elaborate, sophisticated and complex social structures when we bond together through common belief systems, which are our religious doctrines. Famous art historian Camille Paglia, in her masterpiece Sexual Persona, published in 1992, also studied the history of Western civilization through its art, culture and religion, and the intersection of sex and philosophy, and how it shapes the evolution of our Judeo-Christian traditions. She recently stated that the transgender culture we have today is an ominous sign for the decline of civilization and possible collapse, because when the masculine strength and power of civilization declines, it usually is conquered and raped by the barbarians from outside, and this happened to many civilizations in the past, such as the Romans and others. The self-described transgender personality, Paglia has a unique ability to understand both the feminine versus masculine sides to our personality and culture. Another important book published in 1992 is Descartes' Error on Emotion, Reason and the Human Brain, suggesting that Descartes, the famous Enlightenment philosopher, was wrong in declaring "I think, therefore I am," because our cognitive abilities are actually driven, our decision-making processes are driven by hormones, by biological factors such as seeking sex, food and other social bonding, things that we require for our life and social structures. So these built-in systems which evolved form our social psychology, our these adaptations are as important part of our personality as our cognition. This may seem as a philosophical fall of man, because during the Enlightenment, which was based on the biblical Judeo-Christian worldview, man was deemed as being made in the image of God. Our cognitive faculty is supposed to come from God. We are above the animals. This is a dominant view of human nature, where God the Father made man in his image. But now we are looking at a more feminine culture, in which man is deemed a part of nature, it's a loss of male dominance in our view of ourselves. Man, rather as being a rational, heroic figure above nature, is now reduced to working according to animalistic impulses such as sex and others. And this is similar to the Greek pagan homosexual culture that believed in biological determinism. And we see that they believed that they're in a fatalistic worldview, where they believed in Moiras, where old witches who controlled their destiny, their thread of life from birth till death. They even controlled their gods. So there's lack of free will, reason, and free agency. This contrasting worldviews is depicted in this image of ego versus echo. The egoist masculine posture is of dominance over women and nature, the animal world, whereas the ecological feminine side is anti-hierarchical, because testosterone is a hierarchy hormone. It determines social hierarchies, and the feminine seeks to an egalitarian society when there is no difference between men, women, and the animal world. And this image depicts in the early 20th century first wave of feminism, and that led to the communist revolution also in Russia, seeks to demolish the hierarchical structure of capitalist system where the producers are on top, and according to the communists, the working class is exploited, and they are anti-hierarchy and anti-competition. Now, the reason that men are much more competitive than women has to do with sex, because males produce much more greater quantities of sperm than women produce of eggs. Women only have one egg per monthly cycle, which will be, if they get pregnant, fertilized by sperm. So men are much more competitive, and they have the drive for free market enterprise capitalist system, which is driven by testosterone actually. In addition, men are the creators in society because they produce the services and products like food and agriculture and other stuff that their women and children require in order to grow and sustain their family, while women produce the children, so they're much more altruistic and centered on social bonding and empathy. These evolutionary psychological adaptations mean that when testosterone levels decline in society and we become a more feminine social system, we transition to this more collectivistic Marxist utopia, where the producers are deemed as evil, and society is focused on redistribution of wealth from those who have to those who have not. E.O. Wilson writes that this communist model of society is more similar to an ant nest, where the female workers are sterile and serve the reproductive capacity of the queen. This is a perfect communist utopia where there are no males in the nest. Males only perform one duty: they fertilize the queen and then they die. Hence, testosterone collapse causes an economic and financial disaster because capitalism falls. Here we see the chart of how solar activity shapes the rise and fall of civilizations. We discussed before that solar activity causes the hypothalamus, the master hormone regulator, to control the release of testosterone and serotonin and sex and growth hormones throughout our body. And we have in this chart created by Maurice Cotterell, based on work from the 1970s, depicting solar activity and how Western civilization reacted. Now this data is based on a study of tree rings of pine cone trees in California that live to the age of 4,000 years old. So from this data we can see that during solar maximums great civilizations rise. Ancient Sumerian civilization was the most advanced of its time, and inventing writing, the wheel, advanced mathematics, and from this civilization, Abraham, the father of the biblical monotheistic religion that shapes our Judeo-Christian foundations, came from Ur, which was a city-state in Sumerian civilization. We see that this civilization collapsed when solar radiation fell, and then Abraham created monotheism. In addition, ancient Israelites fell into bondage in Egypt during this period until the 1300s BCE under the Egyptian pharaoh. But when testosterone levels and solar radiation levels increased from 1300s BCE, a new ideal of liberty from bondage in Egypt was under the leadership of Moses, that led to the liberation of the Israelis and the formation of the State of Israel. And this state later fell again when solar radiation fell. It was the fall of the first temple was around the 6th century BC. Solar radiation increased again from 1500 BC. This rise in solar activity and testosterone levels led to the rise of great Greek civilization, classical Greek period in which philosophy advanced remarkably, and the Roman Republic was created. Rome peaked around the Roman Republic peaked around the year 0 BCE, and in which period it was transformed into an empire. And then Christianity was born with the birth of Jesus at the year 0. But we see then a decline in civilization to the Dark Ages in the year 700 to the Common Era. Decline of testosterone levels during this period led to the Augustinian theology of original sin, equating sex with evil and the sins of the body and the flesh. And this also led to the fall of the Roman Empire as fertility rates declined, and men became less masculine. The Roman army declined, and Rome was finally conquered by the barbarians. This testosterone collapse into 700 CE also led to the spread of the new religion of Islam, which means submission. This cult of submission is similar in many ways to Eastern religions like Buddhism, in which men bow down in submission in prayer toward Mother Earth, and the earth is associated with feminine cults, nature worship, and anti-individual power and strength. But when testosterone levels increased again from 700 CE until 1200 CE during the Middle Ages, there was a huge advancement in Islam. It's called the Golden Age of Islam, in which great libraries were developed in Baghdad, in Egypt, and even in Muslim Spain. And this led to a great embrace of Aristotelian reason, logic, mathematics, and the rise of civilization. However, as we see on the chart, the medieval maximum was reached in 1200 CE, and then a catastrophic decline into the mid-15th century led to a huge disaster for civilization. The Mongol armies, they were the barbarians of the period, started a huge campaign of murder, rape, and conquest, destroying great civilizations such as China, Islam, and also Russia. They didn't reach further to the West, fortunately for the Christian world, and this led to a great advantage for the West over the East, because it wasn't affected as bad as from this period because of its geographical distance. Protestantism emerged with a new religious revolution that against the central authority of the Pope in Rome. And this is a more masculine posture of independence in which the modern nation states were formed with borders, and the religious theology was transformed. The monk Martin Luther revolted against celibacy and began to have sex, family and children. And the Protestants pastors do marry and have children. Now we see in this chart of the last 400 years of sunspot observations that rising solar activity during the Age of Enlightenment led to rising testosterone levels again, and this led to the philosophy of the Enlightenment of Newton and John Locke, of liberty and modern science, until 1776, in which the founding fathers of the United States declared in the Declaration of Independence the rights for life, liberty and pursuit of happiness. Now the psychology of happiness is a result of rising testosterone and serotonin levels that lead to positive social mood, and people seek more independence, reason, and feel dominant over nature, which are actually the major themes of the Enlightenment. Now again, after the solar activity peaked, it started to decline, and from the 1780s into the 1930s, a very long period in which the Enlightenment was countered by German Counter-enlightenment philosophy, and the Kant inaugurated this period with his famous critique of pure reason in 1780s as a revolt against the culture of reason of the Enlightenment. Hegel and Marx proceeded with their collectivistic, communist and anti-individualistic philosophy. Then Nietzsche declared a revolt against God and the biblical morality. This culminated with Heidegger, and finally Hitler, Nazi, socialist cult of death, and fascism. So we see what happens when these solar cycles change for the worse. Obviously, the founding fathers had a biblical ideal. They stated that man is created in the image of God, which is the father figure. But as testosterone declined into the 1920s, in Weimar, Berlin adopted a homosexual, feminist culture. Women were given voting rights, social democratic system in the 1920s, and Germany collapsed into utter disaster, and the Nazis took advantage of this and rose to power. In this chart, we see that rising testosterone and solar activity levels lead to a masculine culture of independence and individualism. 1776, of course, the United States Declaration of Independence. 1833, Great Britain abolishes slavery when solar activity rises. 1865, the United States abolishes slavery. In the 1950s, Western liberty wins over German Nazi socialism. And in the late 1980s, again, solar activity rises and the fall of Soviet communism. Here we see that solar activity declined sharply since the 1980s till today. This led to many recessions in 2000, 2008. Another recession may begin now as solar activity declines into another solar minimum. Another important social trend is the legalization of marijuana and increased drug use. As people become more depressed, they seek escape from reality to alleviate their pain and suffering, and drug use increases. Another important aspect of the reproductive life cycle, how it is shaped by testosterone, is the generation gap and cultural evolution. We see that different generations have different attitudes, belief systems, and social organization. We see in this chart that the millennial generation is much more liberal towards sex, less conservative, more promiscuous, more socialistic. Now this brief presentation comes to an end. I would like to encourage you to look further into my books, Testosterone Hypothesis, Sex Wars. There is much more interesting information and analysis of the hormonal, biological, philosophical, social trends that we are experiencing today.